Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this week. I'm Liz Mangus, Literacy Specialist with Saddleback Educational Publishing. Welcome. We have a great session for you today around tech tools. We'll start right at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. Until then, as you are logging in, please locate your control bar, which is at the bottom of your web browser window. I think we're all familiar with this routine by now, but just a friendly reminder that when you chat with us today, if you could click on chat and then click on everyone from the drop down, that will allow everyone who is attending live with us today to see your comments. If you forget to do that, only a couple of people will see the comments, and that just is not as much fun. So if you could actually right now go into the chat, select everyone from the drop down, and then just let us know where you are joining us from. And then as we go throughout the presentation today, if you have questions, please use the Q&A area. Yes, you can use the chat as well, but we tend to see them faster if you put them in the Q&A. And if you would like to take advantage of subtitles, you can select live transcript and then show subtitles. We have a few minutes until we get started. This is where you can find us on Twitter. Saddleback is on Twitter, and Katie Welch is also on Twitter. You can follow us, go there, let us know you're joining us for this conversation today. And in the time that we have until the session actually starts, let's bring in Katie, first time presenter on the Saddleback webinar series. Welcome, Katie. Thank you for being here. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well today. How about you?
I'm doing great. The weather here is perfect today, so definitely can't complain about that. And I hope up there in North Texas where you are, you're having a nice sunny day as well, right?
I think spring has sprung, thankfully.
Yes, yes. All right, let's see who's joining us. Welcome, Carla. Welcome, Robert. Welcome, Barbara. Welcome, Sula. Nice to see all of you today. I know it is spring break, so hopefully we'll have people catching us on the recording next week or down the line. I think many of our attendees, regular attendees, may be hopefully on a beach somewhere or just somewhere at home completely unplugged and getting some well-needed rest. But we welcome you, whether you attend live or catch the recording. We're always excited to share this information with you. Hello, Annalisa, welcome. All right, so we were just talking actually about houseplants before we started the broadcast. Took a little survey between a few folks who work at Saddleback and Katie, and the consensus here is we are not so great with houseplants around here. So for those of you who are joining us, if you have any tips on how to care for houseplants and keep them alive and, I don't know, maybe improve our green thumb, if you could go ahead and share that, I would love to hear that because I'm excited. I just bought a new plant and I don't want it to die. So any gardeners in the building, so to speak, let me know your tips. Hello, Giovanna and Virginia, welcome. All right, we are about to get started. Our topic today, and don't forget, anytime today you have a gardening tip or a houseplant tip, go ahead and put that in the chat for me. I would appreciate that. All right, our topic today is parent communication in the home language. This is about translation tech tools. Very important topic. I know this is one that a lot of people are interested in and just want to know what can I do to improve parent communication. And I guess using the home language would be a great place to start, but how do we do that, right? Sometimes it seems so intimidating. Here to discuss this with us today, we have Dr. Katie Welch. She's a teacher trainer with 2 decades of experience, and she's going to tell you a little bit about herself as the session gets going. Welcome to all of our participants today. Welcome, Katie. I'm going to let you take it from here, Katie.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm going to go ahead and get our screen shared out here and wanted to just, again, thank you for being here today. I know many of you are on spring break or wish you were on spring break. I saw in our Q&A, Giovanna was saying that she's about to be on spring break. So that's very exciting. So thank you for taking your time to be here today. And just at the outset, I just always like to say thank you to teachers for just the work that you're doing out in the field. I know this, for some of you, this has been a very difficult year, a brutal year. And so thank you for your commitment. You're in the home stretch, almost there. So I'm going to talk to you today about parent communication in the home language. We're going to look at some translation tech tools that are available. And I also want to hear from you. If you have something, some expertise in this area, or just something that's working well in your classroom, please let us know throughout the talk, because certainly my ideas are here, but your ideas also are extremely valuable. And so let me know if there's more information that you have to add to this topic. I want to tell you a little bit about myself first, just so you know who I am today. My name's Katie, and a few things that I think are relevant to our talk is that, one, I have a PhD in linguistics, so I'm going to be kind of nerding out a little bit on some language. I'm sure there's a lot of language lovers here in the room with us, so we're in good company together. Translation and machine translation specifically is a linguistic, has a lot of linguistics in it. So that's why I like this topic a lot. I do a lot in SeeSaw. I'm down here in Dallas, Texas. And so I have served on the executive board of our local affiliate, TextSeeSaw 5, for a number of years, served as president and various things. I'm currently treasurer. I work as a teacher trainer. Most of my career, I am a teacher, but I also have gotten to work with a lot of teachers over the years. I worked in a school of education for 7 years, training pre-service K-12 teachers, but I also work quite a bit in adult ed, and also have taught in K-12 classrooms myself. And I've also done, as I think many of us have at this point in the pandemic, taught online and hybrid and face-to-face. So lots of different contexts. Thankfully, I started teaching online about 10 years ago. I've always just been a little bit of a techie. And so I think you'll see that today as we talk about some of these translation tools, that I just kind of like this stuff. So that's who I am. And thank you again to Saddleback for hosting this talk today. Originally, I was going to give a version of this talk at TESOL International in 2020. They were going to have a K-12 day, and they had invited me to come and share on this topic. And 2020, as you can imagine, it didn't come to fruition. And so I kind of put this away on the back burner, and I'm so excited to be able to share this information with you today. And thanks to Liz and her team for making it happen. Let's get going. So we have, especially because of the pandemic, which has forced companies to innovate very quickly and accelerate a lot of the tools that they already had kind of in their want to do pile, as they were thinking about what are some things on our wish list that we wish that we could do with our app. The pandemic kind of forced them to accelerate and to prioritize a lot of things. And so we have seen recently that a lot of these ed tech companies are beginning to realize the importance of multilingual parent-teacher communication. And so we're seeing many of these popular apps that are used for communication in school settings. So Class Dojo, SeeSaw, S'more, Wakelet, Remind, all of these are starting to have more higher quality offerings in terms of being able to use those tools in more than one language. And all of these tools rely on what we call machine translation. And so I want to talk a little bit about how the tools work, how the translation works, because I think that helps us to understand how we can then use them in communication with parents. The two kind of that are leading the way in terms of translation are Google and Microsoft. We find that these two powerhouse companies really often, you're either using kind of PowerPoint or Google Slides. We see also in the translation world that these two companies are really the leaders in the industry. And so many of these other tools that we use in our classrooms, such as SeeSaw, Class Dojo, they rely on the technology from usually Google Translate. And so whatever the capabilities of Google Translate are, generally that's going to be the capability of these educational apps, because they are tied into that Google Translate technology. What they do is Google Translate just offers different companies the opportunity to use all of what they have developed and then to put it into their own and to their own service, their own platform. And so anything that you're using that's machine translated is likely tied into one of these companies. Not always, but usually. So what is machine translation? What do we mean by that? So machine translation is the opposite of human translation. So, if we're going to translate from one language to another, it's either going to be done by a person or it's going to be done by a computer. And so, so machine translation, kind of the official definition, is it's the use of computers or software to translate from one language to another. So there is no person involved in the translation. There is a subfield of linguistics. I was saying that I'm a linguist, and so you can specialize in many different areas in linguistics, but there's a certain subfield that this is their area, and it's called computational linguistics. And one of their goals as a discipline is to improve machine translation so that it can translate, these computers can translate as accurately as a human. And despite much money and many years and a lot of brain power, some of the most excellent thinkers trying to solve this problem, at this point in human history, we have not reached a point where a computer can translate as effectively as a human. And so we call this the human parity issue. The computer translations are not on par with what a human can do. And of course, those of us who work with language learners and those of us who love language, this probably isn't a huge surprise because we know that language is amazingly complex, and that when you know just one language, it's amazing what is involved in terms of the syntax and the semantics and the pragmatics, all these things that come together into a language. And so being able to teach a computer to have language in a way that a human does is actually a very complicated task. Computational linguists don't just do machine translating. They also do many other applications, kind of language and computer type things that we use every day. So spelling and grammar check would be a very common thing that computational linguists, it's a problem they're trying to solve, is how do you help Microsoft Word know when a sentence is correct or incorrect. Voice to text, if you do any texting in the car and you might be speaking your texts and then they're showing up, and a lot of times they're not exactly accurate, right? This is a problem that computational linguistics tries to solve. Also auto captioning services. So I have done a lot of online teaching, and I usually want them to be captioned for my students. And so anytime you have that kind of technology, that's also an area of computational linguistics. Of all of those areas, so all the different kind of problems, computer language related problems that computational linguistics seeks to solve, machine translation is the hardest one. It's the hardest one to do. And so the reason is that you have to, first of all, figure out what someone is trying to convey in that original language, and then figure out a way to take that meaning and convey it in another language. And so the layers of complexity there are just even beyond voice to text. I have a friend who posted on Facebook this week something that was relevant here. She's a linguist, and she said, funniest voice to text I've seen in a while, quarreling with sticks instead of core linguistics. So even the linguists who are programming these things and are teaching these computers how to understand language the way humans do, is we can't even get our own word right, linguistics. We can't even figure out how to get the voice to text to recognize it. And I know from having, done so many lectures on linguistics, it's a very difficult word for that voice to text to hear. And so the reason I bring that up is just to say, these are very challenging issues. And so when we approach something like Google Translate, and I'm sure you've had this situation before where you put in some sort of text and the output is not exactly what your intended meaning was, and we can get really frustrated. But there are some reasons why it is so challenging to do this machine translation. So humans are just much better than computers at understanding context to understand meaning. And so we can more readily when we are hearing some sort of language, or we are being exposed to some sort of language, to understand the context in which that language is being spoken. And a computer doesn't have that. And so we have to figure out, how do we design it in a way that it can understand context. And so think about, for example, in an educational setting, we have a lot of domain specific words that are very unique to education. And if you think about the term makeup work, that's when I can't think of a time when makeup work is used in anywhere in the world outside of an educational space. If you can think of one, let me know. But that's one of those where it's specific to education, but so that's makeup. But makeup also has another meaning out in the world, which is just like the stuff that you put on your face, your blush and your foundation. And so we have to help the computers to understand, am I intending the generalized meaning of this word, or the education specific sense of this word? Because a computer doesn't know who the speaker is, and doesn't have, they don't have an environment in which they can say, I'm in a school, so that makes more sense that this would be the school meaning as opposed to the general meaning, then it's harder for a computer to make that judgment, whereas for a human, much easier. We have things like idioms. We know, it's funny because a lot of the issues that kind of come up where it's difficult for computers are also areas where a language learner might struggle. And so idioms can be a challenge because you've got a figurative meaning instead of a literal meaning of a word or of a phrase. And so in a minute, I'm going to use the phrase elephant in the living room, which is an idiomatic expression we use in English. The elephant in the living room it could mean that I have a giant animal in my living area, but it really usually means it's a problem or an issue that's right there. Everyone knows about it, but no one's willing to talk about. So it has this other sense to it. And anyway, it's difficult for a computer to understand that figurative kind of meaning that we see in idioms. For machine translation, proper nouns are a problem. So if you have, I have a friend named Guy, and so that's his name. But Guy can also just be the name for a man. And so trying to help computers figure out the distinction between proper nouns and common nouns is a problem. Polysemy, which is when we have multiple meanings of words. So think about the word bank. Can be like the place where you cash your checks, but it could also be like the edge of a body of water. You can also bank your car in a certain way as you're driving. So trying to help these translation apps figure out, well, what meaning is intended here. And actually with Google Translate, the worst results in Google Translate are going to come when you try to translate one isolated word by itself. Because if that word has 5 different meanings, then Google Translate doesn't know which of the meanings that you're wanting when they have no context. And so that's why if you'll put it into a sentence, then generally you're going to get better results from the translator because it has something to work with. And then another problem with machine translation is that generally, like in speech, we don't always know where the word boundaries are, right? When we're typing, you put a space in between 2 words, so we know that was a word boundary. That was one word and that was another word. But in speech, think about 10 ants. If you're just saying it, 10 ants. 10 ants. Is that tenants? Is that 10 ants? Where does the word stop and end? It's a challenge. And then out of vocabulary words is a challenge as well. Now, what I think a lot of folks don't realize is that when you have a service like Google Translate, they're actually drawing from a huge body of language, like language samples, that when it's trying to figure out what your intended meaning is, it's looking through a lot of data to figure out, okay, well, when have other people used, what are some other instances of this use, and what's the most likely definition and translation of these words. And so depending on what data has been fed into this search engine, it totally depends on what's going to come out. And so it may very well be, especially in like, because language changes so often, if you have like a newer word or a slang term or something that you're putting into Google Translate, there just may not be any data. It's out of vocabulary, meaning the computer doesn't even have that vocabulary to figure out what it is that you're trying to say. And if you think about like for educational purposes, or even if you're working in like a subfield of education, like special education, if the data doesn't include language samples from special education text or special education language, then it's not going to show up obviously in the translation app. So it depends on how they programmed it. And then obviously typos and misspellings are a problem. So if you have someone that is typing fast, or maybe someone who's low literacy, and some kind of translation service is trying to translate that, they may not know what to do with that because it's not the typical spelling of that word. I have a friend who is a Spanish speaker, and he would fall into that category of being having a lower literacy in Spanish and English, but more comfortable in Spanish. So he texts me pretty frequently, and his texts commonly have little misspellings. So if you happen to know Spanish, you've got ver, which is to see. It should be spelled with a V, but he uses a B. And so in a translation app, that can be a real challenge because they're trying to figure out what that is. Interestingly, though, even putting that into Google Translate, they do translate that BER as to see, because it's a common enough error that they've actually programmed it in to translate it correctly. So these are the challenges. So you think, gosh, should we even be doing this at all if these are, the challenges are so great? And the answer is yes, we should. I forgot, though, before we move on, that I have a pro tip, which is one way that you can kind of check and see, was that a good translation? Was that not? If you're using Google Translate, is if you say, okay, I've got something in English and I want to translate it into Spanish, for example. I was just talking about my friend, right? And so let's say I wanted to send him something. And so I typed it in English and then it translated into Spanish. And if I'm not a Spanish speaker, I don't know if that's a good translation or not. And so what I can then do is copy that Spanish translation that they've just provided me, and then put that back in as my input and say, okay, now take that and translate it back into English. And then it kind of helps you to see if there was anything problematic. So it highlights for you, ooh, I may need to reword this one part because somehow in the translation, the machine is not catching that one little piece. So just a pro tip there. Okay, and last thing, and then we're going to stop for questions. So should we use these things at all? I think, if we know that they're not going to work 100% of the time, should we use them? And the answer is yes, we should, but we should set our expectations accordingly. When we're doing any kind of machine translation, we are not going to get a 100% accurate translation, or it's unlikely that we will. We might, but it's unlikely that we will. But we are going to be able to get enough of the approximate meaning or the gist that a speaker of that language would all of a sudden know a lot more information than they did if they had nothing to go from. So just because they're not 100% accurate all the time doesn't mean that they can't be useful. So I just want to give you a quick example of that from my own life here. This is my son, Hunter, and he is wearing a furry hat here. And recently, I think because of just all of the things that are going on in the world, we have a lot of discussions in our house about Russia and Ukraine. And my dad was telling us that he had visited the Soviet Union 25 years ago, and that he had purchased this hat while he was there. And so he brought this over as just something, interesting for the kids to look at. Well, as we were asking him questions about it, he said, gosh, that was so long ago. I just honestly don't remember much about this hat other than I bought it in the former Soviet Union. And so it had a tag on it. And the tag was 100% in Russian. And so we thought, well, maybe we could get some more information if we used Google Translate on this tag. And so we pulled out our handy phone and got on the app, took a picture because this is one of the features of Google Translate, and it was able to translate both the front and back of this tag. And so we learned, okay, this was created at a certain manufacturing company, and that was in fact rabbit fur that the hat was made of. When we were originally looking at that tag, we knew nothing. We had no idea what that tag said because nobody in my household speaks Russian. But after using this translation tool, again, did we get every word translated? And was it a perfect translation? It was definitely not. But we got the gist, and we knew a lot more than we did beforehand. And so it gave us knowledge. I find that this tool, the camera tool on Google Translate, is fantastic. Especially I think of families who maybe are getting, especially in the elementary years, they might have a Thursday folder when it comes home with all sorts of flyers and random things. I find that intimidating as a parent, and I know what they all say. And you're having to sort through and figure out what's important, what's not important. You got some CC's pizza night over here and field trip flyer over here. And so something like this, that again, you can just hover over those pieces of paper and get the gist, is it helps families tremendously despite not being 100% accurate translation. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for a second and see if we have any questions or thoughts on what we've talked about so far.
Okay, I'm looking at the chat right now, and a few people here. Let me turn my camera on so I'm not just like this random mysterious voice. So I like what Chris said here about families are often aware of the limitations of some of these translation features, and so they understand that they might need to do some figuring out if the translation comes out to be a little bit wonky. So, and it could be that over the past couple of years, people have learn that about these tools specifically. So that's a great point. And then somebody else had mentioned, yeah, you always got to double check that Google Translate. So I really do like that tip that you shared. All right, let me head over into the Q&A. So Robert said, this may not be germane, but students can use translation apps or Google Translate on their smartphones for translanguaging vocabulary and texts. So do you have a specific stance on that?
Yeah, I think we're kind of getting, we're not going to talk about translanguaging today, but it's a great question, Robert. And I think my stance would be that I am for translanguaging in the classroom. I think that I'm talking today about parent communication, but I think you can take a lot of these same principles and a lot of these same technologies or something similar and apply them into a classroom setting. And so there's been a lot of great work in this area. And I really think we're starting to rethink how we look at the first language, the home language, in classroom spaces. And so it's relevant in the sense that absolutely you can easily find the jumping point from, hey, we should be communicating with families in their home language, to maybe there's some pedagogical uses for these tools in the classroom.
Yeah. And then Tori said, are there any types of communications for which you would categorically not recommend machine translation?
Yeah, definitely. You want a human translator for high stakes scenarios. So in a legal situation, we don't want an approximation. We want to know exactly what was said, and we want a high quality translation. So a lot of official documents that are going to go home from the school, and generally districts are already going to have things in place for that. They're going to have translators available for those types of things. This is more for the everyday classroom teacher who just wants to be able to communicate with parents and feels like, where do I even start? But certainly anything that's going to be official, you want to you can use this as a starting point. Even if it only gets 50% there, you can then have a human come along and fill in the gaps. But you want a human looking at those high stakes things.
Great point.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. And then Robert put in another question here, which I think is another interesting one about research. He says, how much research have you done? Well, I don't know if it has to be you in particular, Katie, but for adult English learners with using translation apps on their smartphones or on learner management systems like Canvas. So that's an interesting question. Is there a body of research around this for Robert's interest being adult learners, but then everybody else is, or the majority of the folks on this webinar might be more K-12 interested, but what do you know what the body of research around these tools looks like?
Yeah, I think because the concept, where you're going to see these in a classroom application is under kind of the theoretical umbrella of translanguaging. And so the translanguaging research is going to be where you're going to find these things. But what we find is that adult TESOL, kind of education within the TESOL world, it is very much behind the K-12 group. And so we see most of the research in K-12 currently because they're kind of leading the way in this area, and it's taking adult education a little while to catch up. So I couldn't tell you specifically what the body of research is, but I'm positive that the K-12 body is much larger, and it's a great area for up and coming researchers who want to do something in adult ed.
Great. Well, thank you for tackling that. And I'm going to fade away into the background here and let you continue on.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, let's keep going. So we know machine translation is useful. And so in fact, we want to encourage families to utilize these built-in translation features. They can be very helpful, even if imperfect. And so the problem that we find is that a lot of times teachers and parents don't realize that these tools have these features available, or they have so many that it's hard to keep track of what is what. And so we really need to be explicitly naming and modeling for families these translation features within these educational apps so that they know how to use them. And so as an example, in Class Dojo, if a teacher were using this, and this is their main communication tool with parents, there is an option for parents to, they can have the posts and the messages translated into their language. Again, this is likely tied into Google Translate. And so whatever the limitations of Google Translate are, whatever languages are available through Google Translate, likely the same languages in Class Dojo. But the problem is, when you go into the documentation for Class Dojo, it says that if you want to set the account language, that parents have to log into their Class Dojo account and they themselves have to change the settings. So they have to know, okay, I need to log into my Class Dojo and I need to go change the setting. And it's, in their documentation, it says, please pass this info on to interested parents. And so where we really need to work a little bit harder at is making sure that the families are aware of, in these different apps, how they can access translated materials. As a contrast to Class Dojo in SeeSaw, if you happen to be using SeeSaw, and of course my kids' teachers use all the above, right? They're not all on the same page. So often we have families who are using multiple platforms to receive communication. In SeeSaw, it's not set through the app itself. Instead, the availability of these translation depends on the language settings of the user's device. So that is on their phone, in the actual iOS of their phone. If they have established that English is the language of their phone, then they will not see any options for translations, won't even be aware that they're available. And so we have to make sure that we're communicating well to these families. Hey, in SeeSaw, if you want to be able to see these translated communications, then we need to go into the settings of your device itself to make those changes. And so, and just sending this out, a lot of these apps are going to have translated, some translated steps in kind of largely spoken languages. But we know, just as teachers, that modeling for students, how important that is to show them what the steps are and do kind of the I do, we do, you do. And so this would be a great thing to introduce at like a parent night, where you could have maybe stations with different people set up that can show how you access these translations through these different apps. So I want to let you know, I don't know what you're using currently in your in your classrooms or in your context, wherever you are. But I went ahead and created a Padlet for us that has kind of some of these that I feel like are used very commonly by classroom teachers. So Remind, SeeSaw, Class Dojo, Wakelets, more, some of these popular communication apps. And if you go into the Padlet, then you can find the logo for each of those ed tech things, and then you can find the information on how does this app do it? How do you access translations? And of course, they're all different. And so if you're interested in this Padlet, it's available to you here. We've got the QR code, and also we've got the link in the chat. So check that out if you're specifically interested in one that you use. If there is one that you use that is not on this list, then let me know, because I would love to update this Padlet to be reflective of what practitioners are really using. Okay, so we were kind of getting there during the Q&A, but at this point in the conversation, we always need to kind of stop and have a moment where we talk about, why do we do this? Why would we want to do this? Why do we want to provide translated materials to families? It's the elephant in the living room, as I mentioned earlier, that idiom where it's the big issue or the big problem that nobody wants to talk about, but that's really important to talk about. In this case, we've got an elephant in the classroom, since we're, it's an education thing. But the question is, aren't we supposed to be teaching English? Won't this make them dependent on translation tools and not learn the language? I feel like in an audience such as Saddleback's, you are likely not asking yourself these questions, but I'm thinking about just a typical classroom teacher, especially speaking of adult ed, the way that I know that K-12 is kind of leading the way in this area and that adult ed is behind. I was recently presenting to an adult ed room of teachers, and I, made the suggestion that we introduce a little bit of home language into our teaching, and you could have heard the paint on the walls being sucked in when I said it, because it was so contrary to how those teachers were trained, and really how we have traditionally been thinking about the first language over the past 40, 50 years in TESOL. And especially in adult TESOL. And so I think it's important just to stop and say, well, wait, but why is this important? Why would we want to do this? When I think about talking about the home language in general, my first thought, where my mind goes, is to the Princess Bride. That may not be where your mind goes, but whew, you should be me. You should be me and see all the weird connections in my brain. But I want to tell you why I think of the Princess Bride and how this relates. So if you've ever seen this movie, you know that the main character, Wesley, who is this guy here in the middle, he is, there's a lot of things that happen in the movie, but at this particular point in the movie, he is trying to go rescue Buttercup, his beloved, and they're going to storm the castle. And he has recently been injured, and so he doesn't have a lot of strength, and he's got these two friends here who are going to try to help him. And so he asks the question, what are our assets? That is, what is it that we have going for us in this situation where we've got all of these people that we're trying to attack so we can go get into this castle and save his Princess Buttercup. And so, they basically say, well, we don't have much. We don't have much. And he said, well, this is impossible. How can we do this? And he says, if only we had a wheelbarrow, if only we had a cloak. And the two gentlemen say, oh, we do have a wheelbarrow. We do have a cloak, actually. And he says this famous line, what? Come back, Wesley. Here we go.
Why didn't you list that among our assets in the first place?
Why didn't you list that among our assets in the first place? And I think this is really how a lot of our field has thought about the home language for a while, is that when we think about the assets that our students, our multilingual students, are bringing to the classroom, we think about these families. and we think about their first language or their home language, we don't even think of it at all. And we don't realize what an asset it is. And yet there's this growing body of research that's showing that, that again, human language is so complicated, we haven't even been able to teach a computer how to do it as well as a human yet. And so it's this amazing skill that these children and these adults possess. They already know an entire language system, and we can leverage that in our learning environment. We can leverage that. It's an asset, not a liability. And so if we come with that perspective, then with these translation apps, then we realize that there are some actually compelling reasons why we should communicate with families in their native language. So the reasons, some of them are practical. Why should we translate things for families? Because teachers need to know where the field trip forms are. Kids could have missing lunch boxes, and the parents want to let them know, hey, have you seen our lunch box or our jacket? The teacher may want to just communicate with the families with a positive note home. So there's practical reasons. There's pedagogical reasons that we would want to use the first language, the home language. The parents may be wanting to help their children with their homework and may have questions about it, and they need a way to communicate with the teacher about the homework assignment so they can help the student. There may be a student project that they have, something that needs to be communicated with the teacher about, a clarification question. Also, we find that language users, all of us, regardless of which languages we speak or how many we speak, a lot of times we use dictionaries just to confirm things we already know. And so what we find is when people are searching in translation tools or dictionaries, a lot of times it's not because they don't know the word. It might be, but also sometimes people who are maybe a little bit more advanced in their language learning, they just want to do a quick comprehension check. I think that this message means this, but I just want to double check that I'm right. And oftentimes they are right in what they were thinking, but it just kind of confirms for them. And so we see for these adults, these family members who themselves are likely learning English, this can be a comprehension self-check for them. Wahlberg 1984 shows that family participation education is twice as predictive of academic success than socioeconomic status. And so by getting parents involved in this process, by giving them access to the information through a language that they speak, then we are helping to ensure academic success for their kids. So we've got practical reasons, we've got pedagogical reasons, and we have powerful reasons, really powerful reason. Access to information is very empowering. It empowers families to participate, and it also communicates that these families and the languages that they speak are valued in our communities. And so we know that having access to information can be very powerful because it invites them into the process. It can also give agency and voice to not just families, but also to classroom teachers themselves. 2 years ago, right when the pandemic was starting, I was working alongside a 5th and 6th grade ELAR teacher in an intermediate school, and we were in a dual language classroom together. And it's in Texas. I'm down in Texas. We have a new policy about dual language bilingual programs where typically everyone teaching in that program must be bilingual certified and have taken a proficiency exam showing that they're proficient in whatever language that they are teaching. And so, the math, the science, all of these different content areas, they need to be able to teach them in both English and Spanish, or English and Vietnamese, or whatever the language is. But we have a new policy in Texas where the ELAR teacher does not have to be certified as a bilingual teacher. They only have to be certified as an ESL teacher. And so that means they have not taken a language proficiency exam, and they often do not speak another language. So I was working with one such teacher, and so all of her team spoke both Spanish and English, but she only spoke English. And so if she ever wanted to communicate with a parent in Spanish, many of whom, that they did not speak enough English to be able to communicate well in English at that point, she was having to go get a colleague and say, hey, can you translate this for me? And when I showed up in her classroom, I talked to her about an app that I want to talk to you about here, which is Talking Points. And I said, hey, have you ever heard of this? Could I get this set up for you so that you could communicate directly with the parents in your program, where you're typing in English and they're receiving the message in Spanish. They're typing back in Spanish, you're receiving in English. And she said, that would be amazing. And so, while she was up teaching in the front of the class, I sat in the back frantically keying in data for her. And, by the time the class ended, she had this tool available. And you would have thought she was a kid in a candy store. She was so excited because she taught both 5th and 6th grade. Some of those 6th graders she had been with for a year and a half. And she had never really been able to communicate well with their families. And so with this Talking Points app, all of a sudden it was so empowering to the teacher because she was able to have a direct line of communication to families that she hadn't been able to talk with before. So I wanted to mention in our last few minutes together, we're just down to about 5 minutes, two kind of apps, two software that I feel like are the ones that I want you to know about the most. Talking Points specifically, all of the other ones, SeeSaw, Class Dojo, etc., Canvas, they're all designed kind of for a general population in mind. But Talking Points is designed by an English learner for the parents of English learners. And so they are specifically trying to solve this problem of parent communication in multilingual contexts. One of the things that I love about it is that it has a domain-specific glossary with education vocabulary. And so we talked about earlier, this is a real problem with machine translation is, well, okay, how do they know when you're in an education domain or when you're just talking just general language? And they have a glossary that they update constantly with education specific terms to make sure that those terms are being translated in the way that they're intended. They have pre-populated messages for common school situations that human translators have already kind of prepared. So we know they're going to be accurate translations because a human has looked at them. And so this could be anything from a child has missed class to a positive note home, many different scenarios that they pre-populated. If you receive a message from a parent and you have no idea what it means, there's a human translation option, and the parents have it as well, where the message is sent to a live team that then tries to interpret it for you if the machine hasn't been able to convey the meaning in a way that everyone can understand. So they understand the limitations of machine translation and are trying to compensate for that by having a human intervene at the right moment. They have translated video captions. So if you're creating a video, it will automatically close caption in whatever language the parent has set as their language. And if you don't want something translated, so like the name of your school or something that needs to stay in English, you can just put some curly brackets around those words and it won't translate those words. And that's something that most translation apps do not offer. So it's very customizable. So I love Talking Points and I always just want to point it out specifically because it really does, it's designed for this problem. If Talking Points won't work for your district for whatever reason, Remind is a great option, very similar, and they have come a long way in their translation options over the past couple of years. But this one, because it's designed specifically for this population, is just there's not going to be a comparison to it out there on the market right now. And then the last one I want you to see before we stop for questions again and see what we're thinking is one called Microsoft Live Captioning. And I'm actually going to give you a chance to experience this one here in a second. This is if you were having like a parent information night and you had many different speakers of many languages in the room and you wanted to make sure they all were getting the same information. If you were broadcasting your PowerPoint up on the screen, this is a built-in feature of PowerPoint that allows for everyone to see live translations happening in real time as you are presenting. It used to be an add-on feature and now it's just built into the software itself. Microsoft is way more advanced than Google on this. So if you're using Google Slides, this isn't available yet. Those two companies kind of compete with each other. So I say yet, because I would imagine it will come at some point. But I wanted to give us a chance to try this today and see, and I want to, I'm going to switch screens and I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint is going to have a QR code that looks just like this. Not this one though, this is like a sample. And if you'll get out your phone, and if you'll scan that QR code, that way you can kind of see what this one is like. When you grab your phone, you'll open the camera app. So I've got here, let me make it big for you. You're going to grab your camera app and you're going to scan that QR code. It's going to open, and then you should see on your phone the some translations, I'm sorry, some captioning happening there in English. You can click down at the bottom and you can choose the language that you'd like it to be translated into. And then as I'm talking, what I'm saying right now should be translated into your selected language. So let's try this real quick in our last couple minutes together and see how we do. Here we go. All right, so hopefully now you're seeing kind of the back end of PowerPoint presentation. And so I'm going to click present live over here. When I click present live, it's going to pull up that screen that I was telling you about with that QR code. So if you've got your phone, and we'll do this with me, just pull up your camera app, hover it over that QR code, and it should join. I'm going to do mine too, just to make sure that this is working properly. And up at the top, let's see. As you're joining, looks like 31 have joined us, so thank you so much for joining. You should see down at the bottom, so now that we've had the QR code up for a minute, down at the bottom, you should see where it says English. And when you click on that English, you should be able to scroll through and just choose another language. If you speak another language, obviously you could choose that one, or if you just want to try one out. And so what should be happening for you is that as I'm speaking right now on the screen, on the Zoom screen, you should see closed captioning of what I'm saying currently in English, because I set it to the closed captions in English. But on your phone screen, you should be seeing the slide that I'm on in the PowerPoint presentation and whatever language that you selected. So if you selected Korean, then you would be seeing the Korean translation. And then as I go through my PowerPoint presentation, so here I'm going to change slides, and this is sample slide 2. Then you should see now on your phone the same slide that I'm on. So that way the person who, if someone's needing to use this technology, they're not having to look at your screen and look back at the phone and look at your screen and look back at the phone. They can just continue to look at their phone and not only see the translation of what's being said live, but also the image of the PowerPoint slide that we're on. So I'm going to advance slides again, just to show you. This would be sample slide 3. And then here is sample slide 4. And so you get the idea here. This one is, to me, it's like, wow, like, you know, considering what a challenge it is for machine translation and speech to text and all of these things that are such, you know, taking human language and figuring out how to encode it in computer form, to be able to do this and then reach families who might otherwise not have access to information, is, to me, it's just mind-blowing. It's just awesome. So I hope some of you are thinking that too. Okay, so I'm gonna get back out of that, and I'm gonna head back to my main presentation, and we're just gonna wrap up with kind of our final thoughts here. So I'm curious what questions you have about what we've talked about today. Again, just to recap, machine translation, it's very imperfect, but it is pretty amazing. And there are some really practical, pedagogical and powerful reasons for us to use it in our classroom spaces. So questions do you have?
Oh my gosh, this was amazing. There are lots of questions and comments popping in. First, I want to tend to a couple of comments that came in through the chat. Robert said, is this also on Microsoft Teams? I think he was referring to the translation. And I think if you're on Teams and you're sharing a PowerPoint file, then it should work. Is that right?
Yeah, that's how I understand it. I have never personally used it on Teams, but my understanding was that this is because it's a Microsoft capability that that it's the same technology as in both places, and that you would just be presenting the PowerPoint on the Teams meeting. Like
right. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think it exists in Teams in and of itself. I think it lives in PowerPoint specifically. But that would be something to investigate. And then I saw another question. Antoinette said, is this system secure? So I think she was talking about, again, the Microsoft translation, but it's through, it's like an Microsoft Office, like you have to log in to be able to use this, right? So I don't think there's anything like not secure about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I don't, not that comes to mind. I know that those kinds of issues, security, privacy, all of those things are always top of mind for districts. And generally all of these apps are going to provide some sort of documentation about that because it's just such a common question. But in terms of in terms of security, no one is logging into anything other than the speaker. Obviously, I'm logging into my PowerPoint account, and you would have to have, a PowerPoint account, Office 365, something like this to do this. But no one else is logging into anything. Everyone else is just on a URL on the web. And so it would be as secure as anything else is, just a website on the internet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes it can be challenging to understand exactly what people are asking. So Antoinette, I hope we answered your question on that one. But then there were a few other ones that came in actually through the Q&A area, and a couple of them were related, which are there any of these tools that have audio? Because some parents cannot read in their first language. And so having some sort of audio capability would be ideal. So is there anything like that?
It absolutely would be ideal. And it's a great question. I was anticipating that question. So most of these apps, most of the software is going to be text-based. And so even in the live captioning we were just doing, it was the person, we would have to assume that they have some literacy in their native language in order to be able to track along with what's happening. And so the question is, what do you do in a situation where you need that parent to have audio? So there are not as many solutions for that scenario. I wish there were. I know there will be in the future. One of the better ones that's available right now, we've got one of our attendees was saying the Say Hi app. So that one's that I'm not familiar with that one. So in a second, could you tell us more about that in the chat? But what I was going to say was in Google Translate and Microsoft Translate, you have the conversation feature. In fact, let me see if I can get back to that slide real quick, and I will see if I can show you that. But there's a conversation feature where both you and the parent or whoever it is can be speaking into Google Translate, and it translates audio. And so you can utilize it that way. The thing that's hard is there's not a way to like record that audio. And so if you were wanting to send the audio, like as a, voice to text, or like how on your phone you can do a voice recording and you can send the voice recording. It would be amazing if there were a way to do that and it be translated. I don't know of that being available. I'm hoping maybe some of our folks in the chat do. So my thought was you would have to do some app smashing where you got Google Translate, you got it to speak it out loud, whatever the translation was, and then you brought in a second app that could record that and then make that to where you could send it to the parent. So not a very elegant solution.
Right. I'm hoping in the future we might have a more a simpler answer to that. But
Mhm.
this Say Hi app, it looks like has worked for some of our attendees in
Yeah.
this situation. So I wrote it down. I'm definitely going to check that one out.
Yeah, me
So
too.
thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. That's always good to know.
Yeah.
And then this
I just
is,
want to show real quick, if you're trying to find that that conversation piece, it's in Google Translate. It's just the camera one's on the far left and the conversation one's in the middle. So that's where you would find it. And it will change it to oral language. So it's not written. I think it's both actually, written and oral, but there's no way to record it. So
okay. And now switching gears a little bit to talking points. Kellen wants to know, have you seen talking points used from a whole school perspective? I teach students and use it with parents directly, but it could be more effective if families could directly contact the school instead of using me, the ELD specialist, as the middle person. So, I mean, that's a great point. And I love that. I think it's definitely something that needs to be talked about, right? It should be ideally a whole school communication initiative and not just the ELD teacher who's sort of in charge of that. What are your thoughts there?
oh, I got goosebumps when you said it, because I'm like,
Yeah.
yes, that's what is needed. It's what is needed. The problem, and it's available. The Talking Points has a district. It has that functionality, and actually I believe that they have I had seen an announcement where they were saying that they were offering it free for the rest of the year, so it's definitely worth looking into for the district level. I just imagine that the challenge, the hurdles to that are, first of all, helping to get everyone aware of why it's a superior choice to some of the other choices that they're making in terms of reminder, whatnot. And then also just the levels of bureaucracy involved in getting that in place. It's for a quicker, it's doing it from the ground level with a classroom teacher gets it done a lot more quickly. But certainly I think the goal would be for a campus-wide or a district-wide usage of it, because the thing is, if it's a monolingual English speaker using Talking Points, it looks just like any other communication app. They wouldn't even be aware of all these translation issues. So to just a native English speaker who's needing their communication in English, it works just as well for that population, but then it has all of these other features that reach these other groups in our schools that so desperately need information. So
yeah. Is it something that the parents need to get the app as well, or does it just directly text the parent?
directly text to the parents. So they do
Okay.
not need the app. And that most of it is done on the teacher's side to set up. And so when I have set it up for different classrooms, I can make the choice myself, what's the preferred language. Obviously, it's always better to ask the families what their preferred language is. But when we sent it out, we just said, hey, we've set this up. And if you would prefer a different language, just text us back and we'll flip it. And so, so there was nothing for the parents to do except receive emails. Receive texts.
That's even better than the family having to figure out how to get an app, right? And there's a cost. This is not a free service, right? There is some sort of cost associated with that. That's what we figured. Yeah.
No, it's free. Talking Points.
Oh, it's free. Talking Points is free. Okay.
Free.
Oh,
yep.
That's wow.
Yeah, I don't know on the district level those types of accounts what it looks like, but yeah, for a classroom teacher, 100% free.
Okay. Yeah.
That's why I love it so much. And I don't work for them. I just want to say I don't work for any of these companies. I'm not affiliated with them, but I'm just an evangelist for them because I really think I align with their mission and what they're trying to accomplish. And it seems like they're doing it well and right.
Chris wants to know, how does the Microsoft Live captioning compare with the auto captions in Google Meet or Google Slides?
In terms of accuracy?
Perhaps? I think that's what Chris meant. Yeah.
Yeah, I think probably you're going to find that they're similar, comparable in accuracy. Certainly, you can use the English closed captioning as a guide to just how accurate it's, like we were talking about earlier with core linguistics and core linguistics, you're going to have some weird stuff come up anytime there is speech to text. And so I would imagine when you're adding in that layer of translation, it's not going to be perfect. But again, if your goal is to get them the gist, then it should be adequate.
Yeah. Tricia says Talking Points is free at the classroom level only. So thank you for that. And Johanna says our parents and case managers love it. So definitely a lot of appreciation for that particular tool out there. But it is nice to know that there is such a variety. And you can investigate, take a look at the Padlet and investigate the options and decide what might work best for your situation. So we are just about out of time. So let me remind everybody about our next webinar, which will be on April 28th. We will be welcoming Dr. Denise Furlong and Cecilia Zimmer to the webinar series, and they're going to discuss the first steps to welcoming our newcomers. So yes, I know it's almost the end of the year, but we know our newcomers, they come all year long. So what processes can we have in place to ensure the smoothest transition possible, whether they show up on the first day of school or whether they show up in the last week of school. So always a good conversation to have. So you can register for this on our website, and we will be sending out an email as usual with a reminder prompting you to register. And don't forget, Saddleback's new Go Decode is now available. So this is our decodable text for tweens. Excellent option if you have newcomers in grades 4 through 8 who need very simple phonics-based texts. Check this out. You can email me. I'll answer any questions you have, send you some samples. Happy to talk about this. We have already answered all questions pretty much. Let me check the chat one more time. Everybody says thank you and they loved it. Tricia, the recording of the webinar will be emailed out either later today or tomorrow. There will be a link to it, so you will have access to the recording, and it will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. So this is where you can find Saddleback. We're on all the socials, and you can go old school and just give us a call if you want to do that. We're happy to talk to you. And then thank you so much for everything you do. I hope you are enjoying your spring break. And we thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to meet with us today. So, and thank you to Katie, of course, for this great information. And we hope to welcome you back to the webinar series again in the future. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.